Is this really where we were? I'm gonna go back in so we can do a little recap, I guess. I want to hit another bowl, but yeah, I really don't want to have like super dried out eyes for reading. I'm probably not going to read forever, but this will probably be the last thing I do before we get off here today, so the last real activity, if you could call it that. Okay, going dark. Getting nicely toasted. Curry. I've never had curry, like ever. Curry chicken, I don't think. Curry anything. Right, we were like, can you guys hear okay? I don't really like to wear the mic when I read because I'm kind of loud sometimes, if you haven't noticed. Have a problem controlling the volume of my voice a lot. I'm working on it actively. So Mo and Eleanor and Maggie are all back in the same house, and Risa, her mom. Maggie's trying to read herself back into, well, not back, but into the story for the first time with Farid. And Mo is like freaking out, talking to Maggie about how he doesn't want her to have anything to do with these books anymore, blah blah blah. And she agrees that she's not going to, but she's lying and she feels bad about it, and she already knows that she's gonna try to read herself into the book. So there's all of that. That's where we're at, basically. I think we're gonna go back to Dustfinger's point of view in the next chapter. I'm gonna just assume y'all can hear me. So nobody really said anything, but it's cool, it's cool. And Dustfinger's already in the book. We were just last with him and his old friend Cloud Dancer. And Cloud Dancer basically was like just in the story to recap us on everything that Dustfinger missed out on over the years that he was read out of the book. A lot going on, guys. So, chapter 8 is called The Minstrel Woman. This little excerpt is from, I don't know how the fuck to say any of this, honestly. I'm not going to. I'm not. I'm just gonna show you this. The minstrel must go on his way as he has done so long, and so a note of sad farewell lingers around his song. Oh, will I ever come back again, my dear lass, who knows? The heavy hand of death is laid on many a budding rose. E. von Monsterberg. Quoted from Musikanten, Gockler und Vegenten. There, I tried it. I like where I'm at. It was just getting light when Dustfinger reached the farm that Cloud Dancer had described to him. It lay on a south-facing slope surrounded by olive trees. The soil, said Cloud Dancer, was poor and stony there, but it suited the herbs that Roxanne grew. The house stood alone with no village nearby to protect it. There was only a wall hardly chest-high and a wooden gate. You could see the rooftops of Ombra in the distance, the castle towers rising high above the houses, and the road winding toward the city gate. So near, and yet too far to be a refuge if highwaymen or soldiers coming home from war thought it a good idea to loot this lonely farm, where only a woman and 2 children lived. Perhaps at least she has a farmhand, thought Dustfinger as he stood behind some bushes of broom. Their branches hid him, but he had a good view of the house. It was small like most farmhouses, not as poor as many of them, but not much better either. The whole house would have fitted a dozen times over, and more into one of the great halls where Roxanne had once danced. Even the Adderhead used to invite her to his castle. Poorly as he thought of the motley folk, for in those days everyone had wanted to hear her sing. Rich traders, the millers down by the river, the spice merchant who had sent her presents for more than a year. So many men wanted to marry her, had given her jewelry and costly dresses, offered her fine apartments in their houses, and every one of those apartments was certainly larger than the little house where she lived now. But Roxanne had stayed with the motley folk. She had never been one of those women among the strolling players who would sell their voices and their bodies to a lord or master for a little security or a settled home. However, the day had come when she, too, had tired of traveling and had wanted a home for herself and her children. For no law protected those who lived on the road, and that meant that the motley folk as well as robbers and highwaymen. If you stole from a player, you need not fear any punishment. If you did violence to one of their women, you could safely go back to your comfortable home, and even if you killed a traveler, you need not fear the hangman. All his widow could do in revenge was strike the killer's shadow as the sun cast it on the city wall. Only his shadow, as she had to pay for her husband's funeral too. The motley folk were a fair game. People called them the devil's decoys. They liked to be entertained by them, listened to their songs and their stories, watched their clever tricks, and barred their doors and gates to them when evening came. The players had to camp outside towns and villages, outside the protection of the walls, always on the move, envied for their freedom, yet despised because they served many masters for money and bread. Not many strolling players ever left the road and the lonely paths, but that was obviously what Roxanne had done. There was a stable beside the house, a barn and a bakehouse, and between them a yard with a well in the middle of it. There was a garden, too, fenced off to keep chickens and goats from uprooting the young plants, and a dozen narrow fields on the slope beyond. Some had been harvested, while in others the herbs stood high, bushy, and heavy with their own seed. The fragrance borne across the Dustfinger on the wind made the morning air both sweet and bitter. Roxanne was kneeling in the farthest field among plants of flax, comfrey, and wild mallow. She seemed to have been at work for a long time already, although the morning mist still hung in the nearby trees. A boy of perhaps 7 or 8 kneeled beside her. Roxanne was talking to him and laughing. How often Dustfinger had summoned up her face in his memory, every part of it, her mouth, her eyes, her high forehead. It had been more difficult with every passing year, and with every year the picture had dimmed. Desperately as he had tried to remember more clearly, time had blurred her face and covered it with dust. Dustfinger took a step forward and 2 steps back. He had thought of turning back 3 times already, of stealing away again as silently as he had come, but he had stayed. A wind blew through the broom bushes, catching him in the back as if to give him a fresh start. What? As if to give him fresh heart. And Dustfinger plucked up his courage, pushed the branches aside, and walked toward the house in the fields. The boy saw him first, and a goose rose from the tall grass by the stable and came toward him, cackling and beating her wings. Peasants were not allowed to keep dogs. That was a privilege reserved for princesses. But a goose was a reliable guard, too, and just as alarming. But Dustfinger knew how to avoid the gaping beak and stroked the excited bird's white neck until she folded her wings like a freshly ironed dress and waddled peacefully away, back to her place in the grass. Roxanne had risen to her feet. She wiped off the earth on her hands onto her dress and looked at him. Just looked. She had indeed pinned up her hair like a farmer's wife, but it was obviously as long as ever and still as black, apart from a few gray strands. Her dress was as brown as the earth where she had been kneeling, no longer brightly colored like the skirt she used to wear. But her face was still as familiar to Dustfinger as the sight of the sky, more familiar than his own reflection. The boy picked up the rake lying on the ground beside him. He clutched it with a grimly determined air, as if he were used to protecting his mother from strangers. Clever lad, thought Dustfinger, never trust anyone, certainly not a scar-faced man like me suddenly emerging from the bushes. What was he going to say when she asked him where he'd been? Roxanne whispered something to the boy, who reluctantly lowered the rake. Suspicion still lingered in his eyes. 10 years. He'd often been gone a long time. In the forest, in the towns on the coast, among the isolated villages lying in the hills around, like a fox that visited farmyards, only when its stomach rumbled. Your heart's a vagabond, Roxanne always said. Sometimes he'd had to search for her when she had moved on with the others. They lived together in the forest for a while, in an abandoned charcoal burner's hut, and then in a tent with other strolling players. They even managed to hold out within the solid walls of Umbra all one winter. He was always the one who wanted to move on, and when their first daughter was born, Roxanne wanted to stay put more often. In some reasonably familiar place with the other women among the strolling players, close to the shelter of the walls, he would go off alone. But he always came back to her and the children, much to the annoyance of all the rich men who flocked around her, wanting to make an honest woman of her. What had she thought when he stayed away for a whole 10 years? Had she, like Cloud Dancer, thought him dead? Or did she believe he had simply left without a word, without saying goodbye? He could not find the answer in Roxanne's face. He saw bewilderment there. Anger, perhaps love, too. Perhaps. She whispered something to the boy, took his hand, and made him walk beside her. She went slowly, as if she must prevent her feet from going faster. He longed to run to her, leaving one of those years behind him at every step, but he had used up all his courage. He stood there as if rooted to the spot, looking at her as she came toward him after all those years for which he had no explanation, except one that she wouldn't believe. Only a few paces still separated them when Roxanne stopped. She put her arm around the boy's shoulder, but he pushed it away, of course. He didn't want his mother's arm reminding him how young he still was. No, my chat went dark. Oof. How high am I on a scale of 1 to 10? Y'all funny. Just here listening. It went my screen went black. I forget I have to poke it like every 10 minutes. Sorry. Thanks, Mark. I hope you're having a good day. I don't know where I was. Only a few paces still separated them when Roxanne stopped. She put her arm around the boy's shoulders. He pushed it away, of course. He didn't want his mother's arm reminding him how young he still was. How proudly she thrust out her chin. That was the first thing he had noticed about Roxanne. Her pride. He couldn't help smiling, but he bowed his head so that she couldn't see the smile. Obviously, no living creature can withstand you to this day. My goose has always driven everyone else off. When Roxanne spoke, there was nothing special about her voice, none of the strength and beauty it had when she sang. Well, nothing changed there, he said, in all these years. And suddenly, as he looked at her, he finally truly knew that he had come home. It was so strong a sensation that he felt weak at the knees. How happy he was to see her again. How dreadfully, terribly happy. Ask me, he thought, ask me where I've been, although he didn't know how he would explain. But she only said, you seem to have been well off, wherever you've been. It only looks like that, he replied. I didn't stay there of my own free will. Roxanne examined his face as if she had forgotten what it looked like and stroked the boy's hair. It was as black as hers, but his eyes were the eyes of another. They looked at him coldly. Dustfinger rubbed his hands together and whispered fire words to his fingers until sparks fell from them like rain. Where they landed on the stony ground, flowers sprang up, red flowers, each petal a tongue of flame. The boy stared at them with mingled delight and fear. In the end, he crouched down beside them and put out his hand in the fiery flowers. Careful, he warned Dustfinger, but it was already too late. The boy, taken by surprise, put his burnt fingertips in his mouth. So the fire still obeys you, said Roxanne, and for the first time he detected something like a smile in her eyes. You look hungry. Come with me. And without another word, she walked toward the house. Sounds like neighbors are back. Oh, yeah? And without another word, she walked toward the house. The boy was still staring at the fiery flowers. I've heard you grow herbs for the healers. Dustfinger stood indecisively in the doorway. Yes, even Nettle buys from me. Nettle, a small as a moss woman, always surly, sparing of her words as a beggar with his tongue cut out. But there wasn't a better healer in this world. Does she still live in their old bear's cave on the outskirts of the forest? Hesitantly, Dustfinger walked through the doorway. It was so low that he had to duck his head. The smell of freshly baked bread rose to his nostrils. Roxanne placed a loaf on the table, brought cheese, oil, and olives. Yes, but she isn't there often. She's getting more eccentric all the time. She roams the forest, talking to the trees and to herself, looking for plants still unknown to her. Sometimes you don't see her for weeks, so people come to me more and more often these days. Nettle has taught me things these last few years. She didn't look at him as she said that. She showed me how to grow herbs in my fields that usually thrive only in the forest. Butterfly clover, jingle bell leaf, and the red anemones where the fire elves get their honey. I love that you spelled her noise. Murph is great. That's like exactly it. I'm so shiny. Shiny. I didn't know those anemones could be used for healing too. They can't. I planted them because they remind me of someone. This time she did look at him. Dustfinger put out his hand to one of the bunches of herbs hanging from the ceiling and rubbed the dry flowers between his fingers. Lavender, where vipers hide, and helpful if they bite you. I expect they grow here only because you sing for them, he said. Didn't folk always say, when Roxanne sings, the stones burst into flower? Roxanne cut some bread, poured oil into a bowl. I sing only for the stones these days, she said, and for my son. She handed him the bread. Here, eat this. I baked it only yesterday. Then, turning her back to him, she went over to the fire. Dustfinger watched her surreptitiously as he dipped a piece of bread into the oil. 2 sacks of straw and a couple of blankets on the bed, a bench, a chair, a table, pitchers, baskets, bottles, and bowls. Bundles of dried herbs under the ceiling, crammed close together the way they used to hang in Nettle's cave. And a chest that looked strangely fine in this otherwise sparsely furnished room. Dustfinger still remembered the cloth merchant who had given it to Roxanne. It was a heavy load for his servants to carry, and it had been full to the brim with silken dresses embroidered with pearls, the sleeves edged with lace. Were they still... I can't talk. And I'm like all hunched over, all shrimp-like. Where was I? Were they still there in the chest, unworn, useless for working in the fields? I went to Nettle when Rosanna first fell ill. Roxanne did not turn to him as she spoke. I didn't know anything, not even how to draw the fever out of her. Nettle showed me all she knew, but nothing helped our daughter, so I rode out to see the barn owl. With her, while her fever rose higher and higher, I took her into the forest, to the fairies, but they didn't help me either. They might have done it for you, but you weren't there. Dustfinger saw her pass the back of her hand over her eyes. Cloud Dancer told me. He knew these were not the right words, but he could find no better. Roxanne just nodded and passed her hand over her eyes again. Some say that you can see the people you love even after death, she said quietly. They say the dead visit you by night, or at least in your dreams. Your longing for them calls them back, if only for a little while. Rosanna didn't come. I went to the woman who said they could speak to the dead. I burned herbs whose fragrance was supposed to summon her, and I lay awake long nights hoping that she would come back at least once, but it was all lies. There's no way back, or have you been there? Did you find one? In the realm of the dead? No. Dustfinger shook his head with a sad smile. No, I didn't go quite so far, but believe me, if I had, then even from there I'd have sought some way to get back to you. How long she looked at him. No one else had ever looked at him like that. And once again he tried to find words, the words that could explain where he had been, but there were none. When Rosanna died, Roxanne's tongue seemed to shrink from the word, as if it could kill her daughter a second time. When she died and I held her in my arms, I swore something to myself. I swore that never, never again would I be so helpless when death tried to take away someone I love. I've learned a great deal since then. Perhaps today I could cure her, or perhaps not. She looked at him again, and when he returned her glance, he did not try to hide his pain, as he usually would. Where did you bury her? Behind the house, where she always used to play. He turned to the open door, wanting at least to see the earth under which she lay, but Roxanne held him back. Where have you been? She whispered, laying her forehead against his chest. He stroked her hair, stroked the fine gray strands like silken cobwebs running through the sooty black, and buried his face in it. She still mixed a little bitter orange into the water when she washed her hair. Its perfume brought back so many memories that he felt dizzy. Far away, he said. I've been very, very far away. Then he just stood there, holding her tightly, unable to believe that she was really there again. Not just a figment of his dreams, not just a memory, blurred and vague, but a woman of flesh and blood with fragrant hair, and she was not sending him away. This is turning into a romance book, guys. I don't know what to tell you. How long they simply stood there like that, he didn't know. What about our older girl? How is Briana? He asked at last. She's been living up at that castle for 4 years now. She serves Violante, the prince's daughter-in-law, known to everyone as her ugliness. She came out of his arms, smoothed her pinned-up hair, and reached for his hands. Briana sings for Violante, looks after her spoiled little son, and reads to her. She said, Violante adores books, but her eyesight is bad, so she can't easily read them for herself. Let alone that she must do it in the secret, because the prince thinks poorly of women who read. This is a long chapter. We're going to stop after this. But Briana can read? Yes, and I've taught my son to read too. What's his name? Jahan, after his father. Roxanne went over to the table and touched the flowers standing on it. Did I know him? No, he left me this farm and a son. The fire raisers set light to our barn. He ran in to save the livestock, and the fire consumed him. Isn't it strange that you can love 2 men and fire protects one of them but kills the other? She was silent for some time before she spoke again. Firefox was leader of the arsonists then. They were almost worse than under Capricorn. Basta and Capricorn disappeared at the same time as you. Did you know? Yes, so I've heard. He murmured, unable to take his eyes off her. How lovely she was, how beautiful, it almost hurt to look at her. When she came toward him again, every moment reminded him of the day he had first seen her dance. The fairies did very well, she said quietly, stroking his face. If I didn't know better, I'd think someone had simply painted those scars on your face with a silver pencil. A lie, but a kind one, he said just as softly. No one knew better than Roxanne where the scars came from. That they would neither of them forget the day when the Adderhead had commanded her to dance and sing before him. Capricorn had been there too, with Basta and all the other fire raisers, and Basta had stared at Roxanne like a tomcat eyeing a tasty bird. He had pursued her day after day, promising her gold and jewels, threatening and flattering her. I thought he was going to say flattening. We like romance. Threatening and flattering her, and when she rejected him again and again, alone and in company, Basta made inquiries to discover the identity of the man she preferred to him. He lay in wait for Dustfinger on his way to Roxanne, with 2 other men who held him down while Basta cut his face. You didn't marry again after your husband died? You fool, he thought. Are you jealous of a dead man? No, the only man on this farm is Jahan. The boy appeared in the doorway as suddenly as if he had been listening behind it, just waiting for his name to be spoken. Without a word, he made his way past Dustfinger and sat down on the bench. The flowers are even bigger now, he said. Did you burn your fingers on them? Only a little. Roxanne pushed a jug of cold water over to him. Here, dip them in that. And if that doesn't help, I'll break an egg for you. There's nothing better for burns than a little egg white. Is that true? I don't know about that, but maybe. I've heard vinegar. Egg? Jahan obediently put his fingers in the jug, still looking at Dustfinger. Doesn't he ever burn himself? He asked his mother. Roxanne had to smile. No, never. Fire loves him. It licks his fingers and kisses him. Jahan looked at Dustfinger as if his mother had said that fairy and not human blood ran through his veins. Careful, she's teasing you, said Dustfinger. Of course it bites me too. Those scars on your face, they weren't made by fire? No, Dustfinger helped himself to more bread. This woman, Violante, he said. Cloud Dancer told me the Adderhead is her father. Does she hate the strolling players as much as he does? No. Roxanne ran her fingers through Jahan's black hair. If Violante hates anyone, it's her father himself. She was 7 when he sent her here. She was married to Cosimo when she was 12, and 6 years later she was a widow. Now there she sits in her father-in-law's castle, trying to care for his subjects, as he has long neglected to do in his mourning for his son. Violante feels for the weak. Beggars, cripples, widows with hungry children, peasants who can't pay their taxes, they all go to her. But Violante is a woman. Any power she has is only because everyone's afraid of her father, even on this side of the forest. Briana likes it at the castle. Jahan wiped his wet fingers on his trousers and looked at their reddened tips with concern. Roxanne dipped his fingers back in the cold water. Yes, I'm afraid so, she said. Our daughters like to wear Violante's cast-off clothes, sleep in soft four-poster bed, and have the fine folk at court pay her compliments, but I don't care for it. She knows I don't. The ugly lady sends for me too sometimes. There was no mistaking the pride in Jahan's voice. To play with her son. Jacopo pesters her and Briana whenever they're reading, and no one else will play with him because he always starts screaming when you have a fight with him. And when he loses, he shouts that he's going to have your head chopped off. Lord. It's probably going to be stuck in your head for the duration of this book. Because mine too. You let him play with the prince's brat. Dustfinger cast Roxanne an anxious glance. Whatever their age, princes are never friends to anyone. Have you forgotten that? And the same is true of their daughters, especially if the Adderhead is their father. Roxanne made her way past him in silence. You don't have to remind me what princes are like, she said. Your daughter is 15 years old now. It's a long time since she took any advice from me, but who knows, maybe she'll listen to her father, even if she hasn't seen him for 10 years. Next Sunday, the Laughing Prince is holding festivities to celebrate his grandson's birthday. A good fire eater is sure to be welcome at the castle, since the bird is the only one they've had to entertain them all these years. She stopped in the open doorway. Come along, Jahan, she said. Your fingers don't look too bad, and there's plenty of work still to do. The boy obeyed without protest. At the door, he cast a last curious look at Dustfinger, then ran off, and Dustfinger was left alone in the little house. He looked at the pots and pans near the fire, the wooden bowls, the spinning wheel in the corner, and the chest that spoke of Roxanne's past. Yes, it was a simple house, not much bigger than a charcoal burner's hut, but it was home. Something that Roxanne had always wanted. She had never liked to have only the sky above her at night, even if he made the fire grow flowers for her, flowers to watch over her sleep. That's all for today, guys. That was a very long chapter. So, So, it's very bright over there.